The key problem for us in, say, North America and in the West in general is that we cannot agree on what human beings are for.
Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
Well, Cameron, every once in a while, an international sport runs into a theocracy. And we are here to talk about that collision of what is going on with FIFA, the World Cup in Qatar, all sorts of controversy surrounding that, from the Iranian team not singing their national anthem in protest to their government to, there's some European team wearing all black in their warm-up jerseys to mourn the death of the migrant workers that died while building the new stadium. Basically, they built a new city in Qatar to house this. So lots of international protest. One that has been making the headlines, perhaps you've seen in the U.S. news, has to do with the rainbow flag armbands on the captains. So often you have an armband on the captain, and this is going to get weird because we're going to be talking about football, as the whole world calls it, except for the U.S., who calls it soccer. So we'll say soccer when we're talking about the World Cup because we're Americans. But anyway, we recognize that FIFA, the F in there, stands for football. So it's just an interesting thing. So the teams submit, and the U.S. men's soccer team had changed their logo to protest, had rainbow colors in it, to protest laws against homosexuality in Qatar, which I think is 3 years in prison for homosexual acts. And that might be nicer than what actually happens in real life. So yeah, you have a heavily Muslim nation. A lot of countries are going to do this. They wrote in saying this is what we're going to do. And if you wear a uniform that doesn't match the regulation, you pay a fine. And these countries are all like, well, this is important to us, so we'll just pay the fine to protest, essentially. But then just a few days before, or like within 48 hours, I think, of the first game, FIFA, so this is the International Federation Football Association, it's in French, so it's all backwards and messed up and different, but basically that's what it is that I say that as the American, as the super minority in the world of football. I recognize the irony of that, saying that it's messed up and backwards. But so they're like, nope, the royal family in Qatar says you're not going to do it. And there have been some big changes that happened also. They outlawed the sale of alcohol in the stadium during games, which I think is about 50% of the reason that people go to the World Cup. So no alcohol during the game, no sales in the stadium, and no pride flag armbands. And they said, FIFA said, this is a culturally sensitive issue, and you will receive a yellow card if you wear it. So this is no longer just paying a fine and moving on. This is saying your captain would receive a yellow card, which 2 yellow cards red, you miss a game, right? It's a red, you're out. So if you're starting off with a yellow card, that's pretty thin ice. And so most of the teams said, nope, we're going to back down on this and won't go through with it, which I thought was interesting for a whole number of reasons. I'm not saying good, bad, or ugly, but I think there's some fascinating dynamics at play there that I would love to get your perspective on, and think a little bit about cultural trends and political and religious power and how that's shaking out on a global scene.
Yeah.
Any first thought?
You talked about sports clashing with theocracy. I think a theocracy is something that we are predisposed to completely misunderstand in certainly in the West in general, but in North American countries, because we have an idea of religion that is so much more emaciated. we tend to, we've talked about this before, but we tend to still think of religion in terms of personal preference, which, by the way, is a completely bizarre and novel way of looking at religion. Nobody has ever looked at religion like that, except in, really probably since the Enlightenment is when this kind of thinking crystallizes. So
yeah, I mean, can just like play that out a second?
Yes.
Could you imagine a religious conviction determining what beverages were allowed to be sold at the Super Bowl?
Right. Exactly. Yes.
I mean, just run that through your little computer for a second and process that.
Religion is perfectly fine for us here in the West, so long as it doesn't infringe on our freedom and our basically what you want to do. But religion, of course, I mean, of course, religion is a massive, massive term. So let's just speak in general terms here. But really, religion in a traditional sense is binding, and it is a whole structure to life. It's an entire way of life that circumscribes what one does. And the religion in question here would be, Islam. Well, if you know anything about Islam, you'll know that it is just such a set of practices. Completely circumscribes your life. There's a way to wash yourself, there's a way to eat, there's a direction that you need to face when you're praying, all of that. So when that is actually put into serious practice and observed, it's going to clash with many of our notions of self-expression. I also find interesting here,
Well,
Nate. Yeah, go ahead.
no, no, finish your thought.
Well, the other factor here that's interesting is, ostensibly, one of the reasons this protest would be taking place is in the name of, greater affirmation, greater acceptance, greater tolerance. We'll use all these
Mhm.
words here, but it's kind of a double standard though, because the religious observances of this nation in which, that these championships are being played are very different. And so basically wearing this kind of symbol would not be an act of respect in that country, in that culture, and in that religious environment. And so it's actually one way of looking at this is you could say this is also an act of cultural insensitivity, if you will. So I think that's an interesting
Yes,
dynamic there
yes,
too.
that's true, but you have some Muslim countries that have, like, tried to work with this. So, like, or when other Muslim countries have hosted, like, large athletic events, they'll set up, like, an alcohol zone. Like, like, it's not legal in our country, but we're gonna block off this area and
Oh
suddenly, like,
boy.
to try to accommodate for the rest of the
Yeah.
world. Um, so I guess that's kinda some of the thinking of what's going on with this. But here's a, like, a fundamental structural difference that I think if you're coming from a westernized, at least historically Christianized posture, is that the New Testament does not outline a political philosophy or style of government.
Yeah.
Islam is exactly a political formula and style of government. And if we can fuse that and we blur the distinguishing lines there, this doesn't make sense to us. But it's also like it's and if you've ever talked to a Muslim from a Middle Eastern country who does not understand the United States, they see so they see like a Hollywood movie, for
Hmm.
example, or something like X or R rated and think all Americans, this is what
Right.
Christians
Yep.
believe because American is a Christian company and Christians dictate everything that happens. And so since this happens, Christians are
Hmm.
okay with this because they're assuming that the religion dictates the content of everything that's produced. And you run into those people, you're like, what? No, that's not
Yeah.
how that works.
Hmm.
But if you're coming from a country where the entire system does dictate all forms of production, then it you can see how there would be confusion there about what exactly Christianity is, because for them to conceive of a religion that doesn't have a political theocratic structure is pretty wild.
Yeah. And it really is fascinating to linger on that point because we're really apt to miss that. Yeah. So if you live in a country where you're in a theocratic structure, and so everything that transpires for the most part, now there are always people who break the rules, and there are always kids who sneak out at night and go clubbing. I mean, you talk to anybody who's, I've talked to a lot of people from, devout Muslim countries, and they'll say this doing that comes at a much higher risk. But,
Right.
there of
Yeah.
course people will be people wherever you go. But broadly speaking, if you live in a place where whatever transpires has to be officially sanctioned by the government, and where religion and politics are truly one, that is your social imaginary. And so you're naturally going to think in those terms yeah, then if you turn on the television and you see, oh, the Jerry Springer show or whatever new equivalent you have.
Well, I knew people who got their view of Christianity from Friends.
Right. Yep.
This is what it means to be a Christian. We watched Friends.
And it's not just
Okay.
But let's
Yeah.
talk about let's make a okay, let's take an anthropological look at ourselves now for a second. So we would, the official way of stating it right would be, well, we have a separation of church and state in the United States. Okay, that's fine. We can say that. That's right.
Mm.
But I think the truth is actually a little bit more, I don't know, maybe somewhat less flattering. I think we have to say that in the United States, everything is subordinate to liberalism. And I think here now I'll make a controversial statement, and now you can sort me out, Nathan, and we can go down this rabbit trail.
Mhm.
But so the notion that on the one hand, Islamic nations are explicitly religious, that makes perfect sense. But I would say here in North America, at least, liberalism is our religion. And that's the real and it's the
Oh,
serious
yeah.
religion. Yeah, you can't if you defy this
Well,
one, there are serious consequences. You're in trouble. Your Christianity, your Islam, your Judaism, your Mormonism, those are all fine so long as they don't mess with the liberal order. As soon as they conflict with the liberal order, then we have a real serious problem.
yeah, so the soccer player wearing the rainbow armband is functionally the same as a Christian athlete wearing a cross. It's a statement of religion and value. And so the rainbow armband is saying we want more inclusion for more people and more freedom because this is our highest ideal culturally. So that's exactly what happened in the World Cup is you have a clash of religious belief, although one side would not see themselves as holding a and maybe religion is a bit of a stretch there, but pretty close. So I don't know. I don't think what you said is controversial. I think it makes more sense when we just call it what it is.
Yeah, I mean, and it's essentially again a view that is and again, taking us further down, I don't think it's the rabbit trail. This is related because this will bring up some of those really interesting differences. But I would say that the liberal order is predicated on a notion of freedom that is almost wholly negative. And again, just meaning freedom from all
Sure.
yeah, freedom from all constraint, freedom to do, essentially whatever you want to do. The big way of breaking this down is freedom from rather than freedom for. So let me just draw in 2 points real quickly, Nathan, and then you sort me out and let's and bring us back to planet Earth. But Patrick Deneen wrote a book that became an accidental bestseller. Well, I don't know if we could call it an accidental bestseller, but I think it was a surprise to him that it was
Mhm.
such a big hit. But so Patrick Deneen is a his historian. He teaches at Notre Dame University. He's a Catholic thinker, but his book is called "Why Liberalism Failed." You got to give it to him. That's a title right there. And I think by the way, incidentally, if you're interested, it's a book worth reading. It's written in a very crisp and compelling style, and it brings together a lot of really good historical material and thoughts that have been percolating for a long time from a number of different thinkers, but he distills it really, really well and with just a lot of verve and skill. But anyway, he says essentially liberalism hinges on two fundamental mistakes about human beings. So it's predicated on a really bad anthropology, says Patrick J. Deneen, drawing on all these other thinkers. But he says the first one is that it's this totally negative view of freedom, that freedom is best expressed as the ability to do whatever you want, right? Unpremised, spontaneous,
Mhm.
voluntaristic. I just choose. Doesn't matter. No compulsion. I just whatever I want. So that notion of freedom, which I would argue, by the way, is a fantasy and doesn't really exist. But and two, the notion that human beings are radically autonomous and free. That'll sound very familiar. You hear a lot about how human beings are conceived as being autonomous, and he does trace that line of thinking to specifically to Thomas Hobbes's vision in Leviathan, and then later to John Locke, kind of taking Hobbes's thoughts and kind of putting political machinery around it. But the notion that we're radically free and autonomous, and that is the normal ideal state of human beings, and so that is really at the heart of liberalism. But the dysfunction that we're seeing now, the total breakdown, he says is not liberalism failing. He says that's basically liberalism delivering the end result of exactly what you've programmed it to deliver. So it's doing exactly what it should do given these two extremely faulty premises. All right, Nathan, sort me out.
Here's another. Yeah. Well, here's another one though, is that liberalism assumes that people would freely choose more freedom and does not factor in religious belief. So, let's say that Qatar is a democracy, the law would still be exactly the same if all the Muslims had a vote on whether or not homosexuality was legal or illegal. So, what do you do then if you have a group of people that democratically chooses a restriction on behavior?
Right.
You see what I'm saying? So we could say democracy, but democratic rule of people who believe very strict things doesn't necessarily generate, like, you can vote yourself out of freedom
Well, this has been a
pretty
big
quickly.
that's been a big issue for for our nation for a long time, right? I mean, even if you can think about the war on Iraq too, the notion that was so hard for many Americans to swallow, it was just it seemed unimaginable to us that everybody else wouldn't want to live in a democracy.
Right.
And
Yeah.
swallowing that was really, really
Yep.
difficult. But there are, of course, completely different ways of looking at life and looking at political organization and looking at how you put together and maintain a society. But we do
Mhm.
often, again, I think we're often bewitched by this liberal order in which we live, which is, let's face it, very enticing and very seductive in many ways and has yielded some tremendous goods. But we forget that there are actually other ways of conceiving of human life. And yeah, but it also
Mhm.
opens up that possibility of somebody, sort of paradoxically voting themselves out of that conception of freedom, of negative freedom.
Well, this is where we've gotten ourselves, starting with the World Cup. So you probably knew when we started talking about this wasn't going to be a, deep analysis of field play at the World Cup between
The
Cameron and
extent of my
myself. So
soccer knowledge is watching Ted Lasso, okay? Which is pretty pathetic considering that I
okay.
grew up in Europe. I grew up in Austria. I mean, football
Uh,
is a way of life over there, but alas, here we are. I've never gone skiing either. Isn't that sad? It's very sad. Feel sorry for me, please.
oh man, we'll have to fix that. Okay, well, so anyway, let's loop this back around and think if there's some kind of practical application of, like, how do we think of this clash of ideas as Americans? Because, earlier today we were chatting with your dad and I mentioned this and he's like, "Oh yeah," he's like, "cuz that would never work in Ohio because you could just guilt all of the Americans into accepting whatever. There's no like, oh, we're opposed to this thing for real." Uh and I don't know, can you be a professional athlete and not go along with some of the narratives of freedom and expression and protest on behalf of some people? So it's like you can see it when it goes to Qatar. I don't know what to think about the fact that we're so wishy-washy as Americans. Is it wishy-washy or is it freedom?
Yeah.
That's y I'm struggling. I'm not quite sure what I'm asking yet, but I sense there's something odd that this highlights about
Well,
me trying to think about how I fit into the culture
I mean,
around me.
there are a number of different items
Please
here that
help.
we need to distinguish. So, the treatment of marginalized groups in general in Islamic nations, and so that would include people who are homosexual, is horrendous and deplorable. And I think absolutely is something that is deeply sad and an absolute outrage. Then so you have that factor. But then so there's the mistreatment on the one hand, which is prevalent, and
Or women,
the
or
marginalized
Christians,
groups, yeah,
or
women, Christians, yep,
yeah.
exactly. I mean, and again, we're then you get into the question of what the actual ramifications are for a total commitment to Islam. And that is such a big issue that we probably would should bracket that here. But needless to say, I
Mhm.
do. I so take it for what it's worth. I think our friend Andy Bannister has a really helpful way of framing this. And Andy Bannister did his PhD in Islam, has worked extensively with Muslims, but he says there are millions and millions of moderate Muslims, but there is no such thing as a moderate Islam. And I think that distinction is
Mm.
I've found that very helpful over the years for getting some perspective here. So needless to say, if you I mean, if you read the Quran, you read the hadiths, it's inescapable that this is a full theocratic vision with some pretty severe outworkings. And if you
Mhm.
look at nations like this, you do see what that looks like on the ground, and it's sobering. So there's that aspect. But on the other hand, there's the moral vision of, let's just take the three major monotheistic religions in the world, right? So Islam, Judaism, Christianity, all of them have operate with a traditional sexual ethic. Okay. And so that
Mhm.
conviction, now, not all of them would, again, we already mentioned this with Islam. Islam is the one that's explicitly theocratic. So one of these three is going to enforce that moral vision, right? The others will not do that. But that moral vision itself, the traditional sexual ethic, let's just go ahead and state it. That is a legitimate thing. And the fact that we live in a nation now that increasingly is poised to say, no, 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 it's absolute, that view, that traditional sexual ethic is harmful, pernicious, it hurts people, it is actively bad, it is a total social ill. So I think that mindset is to be resisted as well. Now, I don't want to resist it with, violent or coercive, strategies, but I want to stand firmly and say, no, that traditional sexual ethic is, well, I believe, first of all, it's also, I mean, it's part of how human life is made and structured. But I want to say it's also a legitimate perspective, and it should be seen as a legitimate perspective. And the fact that it's maligned and attacked and belittled and mocked relentlessly, I think, is a testament to the intolerance of our age.
Yeah, so are we talking about competing narratives of freedom? Because even when Jesus says something like, "And the truth will set you free," strict monotheistic religions would also claim at some fundamental root that they are all serving the best interest of the flourishing of humanity. I mean, the glorification of God is primary there, but the penultimate, that there's a good a human good that's involved in it as well. I mean, I remember being at a college in Maine on a panel on coexistence, and the Muslim guy was all for Sharia law and thought that Sharia law would make America a much better and more stable and free society. And I thought he was totally nuts. And we talked about it. And yeah, he's a great guy. I invited myself over to his house. Didn't work out, but so good conversation. But his idea of freedom from radical religious judicial structures, we were both interested in freedom. We just had very different ideas of how to get there. So in some ways, we can say that as Americans, our highest ideal is freedom, true liberalism. But actually, would you not say that true liberalism is a subpar freedom to what Christ
Oh,
offers?
absolutely. Yeah, and here's where I do think the real rub comes when we look at definitions of freedom. So let's just both speak as Christians for a second right now. And
As
as we
we do.
do, as we can't not do that. So let's bring in also the traditional we'll bring in the traditional sexual ethic here. So because I used some pretty strong language there. And again, I want to operate in a field of persuasion rather than coercion. So let me make that very clear. But true freedom, I would argue, is for freedom to be what you were made to be. And so anything that inhibits you expressing your true nature as a person made in the image of God, anything that inhibits that begins to take away from your freedom, and it begins to put you into various forms of bondage. Now, speaking of the world of sexual expression, I mean, indeed, the whole the whole frame of or I mean the whole world of the sexual revolution, and I don't know when you precisely want to chart this, the late 1960s, somewhere around that time period, and which has been flowering ever since. I would argue, has resulted in greater and greater forms of bondage for people. And so you may be able to, so on the one hand, this may sound a bit strange. So for some of our listeners, this won't sound that strange, but just bear with me here because I think it will for some. So it may
When Cameron is about to say something that's gonna sound strange, buckle up,
buckle up, right?
everybody.
Yeah, this the from the guy who likes clowns and carnivals. But look, it may sound like you are more free when you're able to express yourself however you like sexually. But if what Christianity says is true, that is not necessarily the case. In fact, whenever you depart from basically ways of modes of behavior that flow naturally from your nature, when you start to behave in ways that are other than that, you actually take upon yourself more and more bondage, and you're less and less free. Now you may be making these decisions, you may be choosing to pursue these relationships or these various sexual avenues, but they're not making you more free. They're actually enslaving you more and more. And that's also not limited to the sexual world as well. I mean, this is, if you look at the language surrounding sin, the language of bondage features pretty prominently. Paul is really big on doing that. And so ironically, the more you do whatever you quote feel, or you follow your impulses, right? The less and less free you are. I mean, in the classic picture here, I do think for us modern people, addiction furnishes us with a very helpful picture of sin. Because again, the addict, the person who is led on the leash of their desires or their impulses or their urges, is not free. That person is enslaved.
Mhm.
So that, if we look at freedom like that, the more we come under the rulership of Christ. And again, we do so. I want to so in Islam, here's let me draw a quick contrast and then I'll shut up for a while. But in Islam means surrender, by the way. When you surrender
Mhm.
to Allah
Yeah.
in
Or
Islam,
submission,
yeah,
yeah.
this is a very austere and kind of severe picture of surrender. There's a heavy sense of obligation attached to it. There's a heavy sense of fear and trembling attached to it. But when it comes to surrendering to Christ, it's a very different picture, because that surrender is predicated on the love of Christ. And it's not necessarily a heavy feeling of obligation, it's more trust. And it's the trust that would come about from recognizing that, Jesus, you are my maker. You made me. You knit me in my mother's womb. You are the author of human life. And therefore, you have the proper and the right authority over human life, not in a vain or capricious sense, but in the sense that you want human beings to flourish, to come into their own, and to truly shine forth as what they are made to be. Now that's a very different picture of freedom than, I think, the one that's on the market right now.
Yeah. Well, and let me just say that I don't think well, help me with this quickly because there are 2 things going on in my mind. I appreciate that deeply, and you're talking about systems of seeing the world with a high degree of oughtness, and
Mhm.
when the "is" overlaps with the "ought," then you find freedom in that. Um, However, this idea of freedom as an American ideal and religion, I'm thinking New Hampshire state motto, "Live free or
Mhm.
die."
Right.
That's
Yep.
1788. I live in a state. Our state motto, Montanae Siempre Liberi. Mountaineers are always
Mm.
free, 1863. That view of freedom, okay, so there's that as like a state identity of freedom. And then I'm trying to balance that in my mind with um, somebody just gave me a copy of the Bruderhoff's Fall Quarterly, and it's all about vows. And so people have taken vows of celibacy and poverty and medical vows of behavior and talking. It's all about the freedom found in making a vow. And so
Mm.
you're
Yep.
you're necessarily like you're putting self-imposed parameters on yourself in order to be free to be something or to do something.
Mhm.
And so that whole um there's like a like true freedom is so like the word freedom is so used, but true freedom is so um rare
Yeah.
that it's almost hard to talk about it in the same categories.
Well, you
So
know
I don't
why?
know. That's
You know
just
well, here's why, though, and this thought is not original to me, this is Alistair McIntyre. The key problem for us in, say, North America and in the West in general is that we cannot agree on what human beings are for. Because if we did that, if we said there's a purpose and there's a telos to human life, there's an actual end to human life, end in the sense that of a purpose, a destination. If we did that, then we would have to commit to a fundamental vision, and it would place constraints on us. But so it's here's the way I've often illustrated this. Look, if you came across a group of construction workers, I think I've used this on the podcast before.
oh no, come on, use soccer.
Oh
Use
gosh,
soccer.
okay, let's use soccer.
Can you do
I
it
can
with
do it with
soccer?
soccer.
Let's see if you can pull this
All right, yeah,
analogy
yeah, you
off.
can do it with
Okay.
soccer, any game. Look, you come across a bunch of soccer players or football players, for those of you who are keeping score on proper terminology. They're standing around on the field. They're holding the ball. They're looking at it, and they're just generally perplexed. And they just say, "We have no idea what any of this is for. We don't know what these two big, huge white goal things are for with nets, and we don't know what this ball is used for. We don't know any of the rules." Well, we would say, man, something has gone profoundly wrong here. And they're confused on a very simple but on a very profound level. It's the same if you came across a group of scientists who were in a laboratory, had no idea how any of the equipment worked, didn't understand any of it, looked at all the equations and were just completely confused and nonplussed. Okay, so that's, these are kind of funny examples, but we hold conferences all the time on the question, what does it mean to be human? Or what is human? What is humanity? So that's okay. Is that a legitimate question? Yeah, I suppose so. But has something profound happened if we're some of our deepest struggles and culture wars surround the question of what it means to be a person and human identity? Yes, that's you're seeing something. And the problem there is that we don't want to agree on what human beings are for because we're committed to this notion of freedom that says, well, no, 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 you're free. You can be for whatever you want to be. But of course, that's actually a terrible burden for many people because folks reasonably want to ask, okay, but what on earth am I supposed to be for? Well, whatever you want. So just try this, huge wardrobe of different identities and different sexual orientations and just, test drive all of this and see how you feel. And it's leading down a road of chronic loneliness, mental illness, so much pain.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so here's the thing, is if there was not a internationally standardized soccer field or set of
Yeah.
rules, you could not have a World Cup.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so the sizes, the boundaries, the rules, doesn't matter what language you speak. The yellow card, everybody knows what that
Yeah.
means. Um, and so there is freedom.
You're now
If I'm
if
hijacking your
with
thing
all of
here.
that in place,
Yeah.
you're now free to play soccer. Take it all away,
Yep.
you're n and yeah, could you take the ball and do whatever you want with it? Smack somebody in the head with it? Yep, sure, but I mean, you're not gonna be playing soccer. You're not so it's not really a vision of freedom when you just can do whatever you want free of all constraint and then just yeah, maybe just take it in a really destructive direction or start hitting people over the head with beakers. Here's the picture of the scientists again. But no, true freedom necessitates constraint. It necessitates rules and it necessitates purpose and a destination. And that might sound foreign initially, but it's not that foreign. I remember years ago when I was in college when we were studying poetry, my professor pointed out, and some professors, it depends on who your professor is. Some of them can get pretty persnickety about free verse poetry. So this professor was not a fan of free verse poetry. But I remember, so we were studying Shakespeare's sonnets, and Shakespeare's sonnets followed a very precise set of rules. And I remember him saying, "All right, now you guys all have to write sonnets and you have to follow this precise set of rules." And we were, typical college students. Oh man, what a drag. How am I going to express myself creatively with all these rules? But he pointed out, he said, "Look, these rules, I think you're going to find these rules actually are going to free you. Because once you submit to this set of rules within that structure, you can do whatever you want. And you're true. So in that sense, these rules will free you." And, shocker, spoiler alert, we all found that to be the case and discovered that and I don't even, the word structure sounds cold and clinical and impersonal. So this design, that's a better word, or these rules of craftsmanship for this particular type of poetry ended up liberating us. May I suggest to you, as we close this long and somewhat elliptical and meandering episode, that the same is true of human life. So if Christianity is true, you are crafted by the living God. I do come back again and again to the verse in Ephesians where, Paul says we are his craftsmanship, his poema, I think, right? Made for good
Mhm. Yeah.
works. And so if that's true, then freedom consists in your surrender to Christ and his way. But that surrender will not result in the loss of your freedom, but it will actually be the true liberation of your soul. And it will allow you to become what he has made you to be. Just something worth thinking about and worth pondering in the oncoming days. But thank you so much for sticking with us. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Yeah, and this podcast was less than half of a soccer game, so it really wasn't that long.
There you go.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.